All right, 307 students, this is the employment law update that I mentioned at the end of the last video. We don't do a review of employment law in 307, but there was something that happened between the last time I taught the course and this time. It's not included in my textbook, so I wanted to update you all. It concerns the employment contracts, and that follows very nicely on the tail of our review of the chapter on contracts. Chapter 3 related to the elements necessary to have a binding contract. Now we're looking at a specific type of contract, or types of contract actually. Okay, in an employment law situation, there are two types of contracts. There are term contracts and there are contracts of indefinite hire. A term contract is, just by its very nature of the way it's described, a contract for a specified time period. It comes to the end at the end of that term, and no further notice is required to give to the employee for the contract to come to an end. In other words, I don't have to say, oh, his one-year contract is coming up to an end at the end of August, so I'd better mid-August give him notice of this. No. He just, he comes in on the September the 1st, and you go, hey, what are you doing here? And he says, hey, I work here. And you say, no, you don't. You had a term contract. It came to the end on October 31st. Goodbye. So that's a term contract. Then there are contracts of indefinite hire, and a lot of master-servant relationship type contracts are this type, where you hire somebody with no termination date in the contract. Quite often the contracts are even verbal. So when the contract is going to come to an end, there is a requirement at law that you give that employee some notice or pay in lieu of notice. How much? Well, we're not going to get into that too much, but really what you have to do is you have to look at the all those items listed in the Bardell versus Globe and Mail case that we talked about. The length of the employment, the type of employment, the possibility of future employment, the employee's background, all sorts of things. But it really boils down to whether they were just an employee or whether they were a supervisor or a manager. Okay. If they're an employee, then you have to give them notice pursuant to the Employment Standards Act, and that specifies that, you'll remember that after 1 year, you get 2 weeks notice. After 2 years, 2 weeks notice. After 3 years, 3 weeks notice. 4 years, 4 weeks notice, up to a maximum of 8. So if someone's worked for you for 28 years as a line worker, technically you're only required at law to give them 8 weeks notice, unless some of these other things come into play. Let's say they're a supervisor or more clearly a manager, then you have to give them more notice because in addition to the statutory provision, judges have said in certain cases people are entitled to more than just the statutory notice. And so we use in the course roughly 1 month per year of service. So if the person's been with you for 9 years, you would have to give them 9 months notice, or pay in lieu of notice to let them go if they're a manager, as opposed to giving them the 8 weeks, which is the maximum they would be entitled to under the Employment Standards Act. Okay, so those are master-servant contracts or employer-employee contracts. A lot of employers say, well, I don't want to go to the hassle of having an employee doing the EI deductions, keeping the employment records, doing the workers' compensation. So I'll hire them as an independent contractor. Then the question is, are they really an independent contractor? And the answer is quite often no. They more closely resemble an employee. So you call them an independent contractor, you call them an independent contractor, you call them an independent contractor, you let them go pursuant to an agency relationship, and bingo, you get sued and you will lose. So one of the easiest ways to really sort of protect yourself in this regard is look at the Canada Revenue Agency guidelines for determining whether someone is an employee or not. And those are listed on slide 53. Are they hired to complete a service for a fee? Do they own their own tools? Do they control their own work and their hours of work? So in other words, you hire someone as an independent contractor to do something, and you come into the office one day and you say, well, where's Ralph, my independent contractor? And somebody says, oh, I don't know, he didn't come in today. So you take your phone and you dial him up and you go, hello, this is Ralph. Ralph, this is, Fred at the office. And hold on, Fred. Oh, I'm in the rough. Ralph, are you playing golf? Well, yeah, not very well today. Well, you're fired, okay? Well, no, you can't do that. They're an independent contractor. As long as they get the work done, they control their hours. Whether they come into the office when you want them to or not is totally irrelevant. So Ralph woke up. It was a nice day. He thought, okay, I'll golf today and I'll work tomorrow because it's supposed to rain. So they have to control their own work. No tax, government benefits are deducted from what you pay them. They're supposed to remit that themselves. They invoice you for services rendered. Okay? An employee doesn't work, there, I finished an 8-hour day, I better send in my invoice to my boss so he'll pay me. No, the employees don't. The employer has to keep track of it. He's worked 8 hours, he's entitled to this amount of pay, bingo, there you go. But an independent contractor will work for a period of time to do a job, then they'll do up an invoice and they'll give it to the business, and the business will pay them. Okay. Now, you have to be really careful not to call these people employees. Okay. Oh, I hired Ralph. No, you didn't hire Ralph. You contracted with Ralph to have Ralph provide you with services. All right. And then he pays his or her own expenses. So in other words, for example, it may be a job that requires winter gear, weather gear. Well, you hire an employee to do work outside. You don't, buy them snowshoes and stuff like that. They're expected to buy that out of their wages. So same thing with an independent contractor. He has to pay for all these things himself. Then he assumes or she assumes the risk of loss or profit. Okay, so you look at those things to decide whether they're an independent contractor or not. That was fine. That was, a little muddy to try to figure out maybe whether you're an independent contractor or not, but it was pretty clear, the division between an employee and an independent contractor. Then along comes the courts, and in order to compensate someone who they feel was an independent contractor for more than he would have gotten if he was an employee, they create a new category, okay? And this is on slide 54, and the new category is something called a dependent contractor. So you've got an employee, a dependent contractor, and an independent contractor. And this is really outlined in the case of Pashi versus MDE Enterprises Ltd. And it came about in a decision of 2018, and it is a BC decision, although there are cases in other provinces following along the same concept. And in there, the judge stated, an individual may be determined not to be an employee, but still be entitled to reasonable notice because the worker falls somewhere on the continuum between an employer and an independent contractor. Okay, such a worker is entitled to notice, albeit somewhat less than that of a regular employee. So if you can let an independent contractor go and give them no notice, and you have to give this employee 6 weeks notice, then a dependent contractor would be somewhere in between there. And where the person falls really depends on the situation. So now the employment situation has been muddied even more. All right, I don't think that we have to say anything else about that. So there you go. That was a very short explanation of this development of the law. And about the only other thing you might want to sort of familiarize yourself with is the those things that determine how much notice an employee should get, although it doesn't really relate directly to the dependent employee. All right. And that's it, and we'll get on to the next chapter, which is sole proprietorships and partnerships, in the next video. Thank you very much.